Pick a nice font, they said. It'll be easy, they said. Look, choosing typefaces is really hard, especially if you don't have a design background. But if you can keep these 3 things in mind, your life will be a lot easier. Thing 1. In general, when choosing a typeface, you want a Swiss Army knife, not some fancy Klingon sword. Now, what on earth do I mean by that? So let's go to Adobe Fonts, and just scrolling down the homepage, you can see there's a lot of different fonts available for you to choose. Adobe Fonts apparently has over 20,000 fonts that you have access to with your Creative Cloud account. And some of them are pretty cool looking, but they also seem kind of like one-trick ponies. Like if you need some fancy, vaguely Eastern feeling font, this one might be perfect. But you can see there's not many options. It comes with a lightweight and a regular weight, and it really has a very distinct personality. And for most things, especially if you're an editor being asked to make type choices, you don't want to go towards fonts like this. You want something much more versatile, and I'm going to show you how to find that. So on Adobe Fonts, go to All Fonts. You can see there's over 3,000 font families to choose from, so let's narrow that down a little bit and make our lives easier. For the vast majority of projects that you're going to work on, you are going to want sans serif fonts. So first, let's click that. Now, what does sans serif mean? Well, sans serif should probably be pronounced sans serif because sans is a French word that means without. So sans serif means without serifs. Now, what are serifs? Great question. Serifs are those protrusions on the edges of letters that you see in books and on typewriters. They tend to make type easier to read at small sizes. Your eye can kind of flow across the serifs when you're reading. And here's an example of a serif font on Adobe Fonts. And you can see that while they look cool, they also tend to make your design look a little older, which a lot of times you don't want. So let's go back to our sans serif page here. You can see we still have 883 font families. So it'd be nice if we could narrow that down a little bit more. So scrolling through this, you can see that some of these look pretty plain. They don't really have a distinct personality, which most of the time is what you want because you want the footage or the rest of the design to be doing the talking. The type should be there to support the design and to get information across. And so I want to eliminate any typefaces that have too much personality. So I'm going to click on Clean for the tags. Now we're doing better. Now we have 68 font families to choose from. Now remember I said you want to pick a Swiss Army knife. And what I mean by that is you want a font that's going to give you a lot of options and be very versatile. And so a good way to sort by that is to sort by the number of fonts in the family. So if I bring the minimum up to say the halfway point, now there's only 16 typefaces to choose from. Let's take a look at one. So this font is Elsa. And if we click on any of these images, we can see the entire font family. So Elsa has 16 font weights, and if we scroll down, you can see that we have everything from a nice, really thin, clean font all the way up to a really thick black weight. And this is going to be really, really helpful when I give you the next 2 tips. The good thing about having all of these different weights is that because they're the same typeface, we know that they will all work really well together. This saves us from having to find 2 typefaces that work well together, which is doable, but is a lot trickier than just finding one family that has a bunch of weights already given to you. So now we can just scroll down and check out all the typefaces that Adobe Fonts is offering up to us and just notice some of the differences about them. If you look at the letter forms in Basic Sans, they're a little bit funkier than the typeface we were just looking at, Elsa. And the more typefaces you look at, the more you'll just kind of develop an eye for these sorts of things. This to me feels a little bit quirkier, a little bit friendlier, a little less corporate. But if I come down here to Interstate, Interstate does feel pretty corporate. It feels almost like Helvetica. It's just very clean. You could probably use it on anything, but it's not going to add a lot of personality to your design. So these are the types of fonts I tend to gravitate towards for the bread and butter work that I do as an editor. Interstate comes with 36 different variations of the font, including several weights and also a compressed version of the font. Compressed fonts look like their parent font, but the advantage is they're taller and narrower, so you can fit more type in the same amount of horizontal space, which is really useful for things like YouTube thumbnails. But just look at the variety. You've got everything from a hairline weight, which you can almost barely read it, all the way down to ultra black. Not even just black, it's ultra black. All right, I'm gonna activate this font and I don't need the compressed or the condensed versions. I'm just gonna use plain old Interstate. And then just in case I want something that has a little bit more personality to it, I think I'm also gonna activate Basic Sans, which as you can see has 14 weights all the way from a thin weight down to a black weight. So that is step 1, choosing a Swiss Army knife typeface. And here's the second thing. Contrast is king or queen. So let's say that you need to lay out type that's going to be a title on the end of a video. And you've got two ingredients. You've got the main title, which is going to be the name of your client, EJ Associates. And then this is their tagline that they want underneath that at the end of the video, probably over some very corporate looking shot like this. So let's first think about how we can use the interstate typeface that we selected to lay these out in a way that looks nice. And we're going to use contrast to do this. Now, contrast is one of the most important design and animation principles for that matter. And here's how it works with type. This right here, this is the primary title. So this needs to be more important than this. That's called hierarchy, by the way, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So there's a lot of ways we can create contrast between these two type layers. We could scale this one up and make it bigger. That would certainly help. But that's still not really enough. Your eye doesn't really know which thing to read first. So why don't we come over here, and you can see that the interstate typeface is set, but we're using the regular weight, which is sort of the default standard weight of typefaces. But if we open that up, you can see we have a whole menu here. We have a smorgasbord. And let's choose the bold weight and see what that looks like. That's great. There's definitely more contrast there, but let's keep going. Black. Wow, there's a ton of contrast there. And ultra black, which I think is a little bit too thick. So I'm going to move this back to the black weight and leave it there. But remember, it can also move the other piece of type the other way. We can make it thinner to add contrast. So if I select this other piece of type here, and instead of regular, we say light. Cool, so now there is a ton of contrast between these two things. And we can just roughly line them up. I'm gonna hit the apostrophe to bring up my guides, and that way when I select one of the layers, I can light up the center point with it. So this type layout is far from done, but at least now you can see what a big difference it makes in terms of the readability and telling the viewer what thing to look at first, what thing to look at second. I'm just gonna kind of roughly scale this thing down so it's about the same width horizontally so we can really take a look at this. So I want you to notice a few things here. I want you to look at the shape of this A and the shape of this A, and notice that they are the same. This is why it's really important to choose typefaces that give you lots and lots of weights, because if you found a thin typeface that you like and a thicker typeface that looks almost the same and you use them together, it won't work. It's way better to choose one typeface that has more weights, or as I'm about to show you, choose two typefaces that look totally different. I also just want to point out one more time how different these two weights are. This is a lot of contrast, and if you're not used to designing, you may have a tendency to be a little bit too subtle with the amount of contrast you put in your type choices. And so I'm here to urge you, go big or go home. Now, I did mention if you are going to try to combine two typefaces, it's a lot easier to do that if you pick a typeface that is really, really different than the other typeface. So let's actually pick out a serif font now, and let's pick out one that will contrast a lot with that EJ Associates type, that really big fat font that we're using. So let's pick out a font that has a thin weight to it, and I can do that down here in the weight classification settings by clicking this button. So I can see there's 191 serif font families with light weights that I can choose from. That's a lot, so let's narrow it down a little more. These tags can be very helpful, and there's actually more. Sometimes you have to click a button to show them all, and I think I'm gonna try the friendly tag. So now there are 8 font families, a lot more manageable, and I'm looking for one that feels very, very different from Interstate. Now they all look different than Interstate, but some of them have more personality and some of them have less personality. And that's really a good way of starting to develop your eye for typefaces. If a typeface feels a little bit more corporate, like maybe this gimlet text typeface, then I think that one will feel a little bit closer to Interstate versus, say, this one, Monarcha, which feels completely different. And so scrolling down, I kind of like this font. First of all, I like the name. Who doesn't like a font called Tuna? But also, this one feels kind of in the middle. It's like got some personality, but not too much, and I think it's really pretty. And Tuna has the added bonus of having a whole bunch of weights, which is a nice option. So I'm probably gonna use one of the lighter ones, but it's nice to know that I have the options if I want them. So we'll activate those. And so now let's change this typeface to Tuna. And the first one I picked was the light typeface, which I actually really like. And now I'll just scale that down a little bit so it roughly matches the width of EJ Associates, and there we go. And so here you go, you have 2 examples, the exact same type in both cases, but using different typeface choices. And really all we did was focus on having a lot of contrast between the 2 lines of type. In the first case, just using different weights and having contrast between those. And in the second case, having contrast between weights and the type of font itself. This is a sans serif font, and this is a serif font. So that was tip 2, and I know I'm throwing a ton of stuff at you really fast right now. So if you'd like a free PDF cheat sheet to download and reference whenever you want, you can get it at schoolofmotion.com, totally free. The link is in the description. All right, tip 3, fancy is risky. You wanna keep it simple, silly. What do I mean by that? So let's say that this is the last shot of your video and you need to lay out the type right on this. Well, let's choose one of these type layouts, and I kind of like this one, so why don't we grab this, copy it, and paste it. So clearly we have some issues. Issue 1 is the type is black, and it's gonna be really hard to read that. Let's make it white. Oh, and by the way, at the last minute, the client said they want their website on the end screen as well. That never happens, right? Let's turn this piece of footage off for a minute, and then duplicate this layer, move it down, and we'll put in the URL www.hatsandpants.com. All right, so we're gonna keep this simple and we're gonna follow a process that I follow almost every single time. So the first thing you do is establish hierarchy. And what is hierarchy? It's very simple. We already kind of hinted at it. Hierarchy is the answer to this question. What do I want my viewer to look at? First, second, third, fourth, and so on. So if we're looking at this type layout, we first want people to look at EJ Associates, then we want them to look at designing hats and pants since 1949, and then we want them to look at the URL. Now, when people read, they typically read from top to bottom, obviously. And so simply by having the URL at the bottom, we're already kind of establishing the hierarchy that is the last thing you should read. But I think we can help it a little bit more by playing with contrast. Which brings me to the next rule I follow, which is use as few weights and sizes as humanly possible. Right now, we have one large-sized sans serif font, and we have one thin serif font that's a little bit smaller. So let's examine what we have here. Now, because we're doing this in After Effects, the point size that you're seeing here, 90, is not actually accurate because this layer is also scaled up over 200%. So to make this a little easier, I'm just gonna set the scale of all of these to 100%, and then I'll adjust the point size over here in the character panel to get the EJ Associates back to the size I want. EJ Associates is set in Interstate Black at 202 point size. This line is set in Tuna Light at 90 point size, and the URL is also set at 90 point size. So currently we have two fonts and we have two sizes, and that's totally fine. But we do have a third piece of type on the screen now, and we want to manipulate something. So ideally, I only want to manipulate one of these two things because otherwise I'm breaking my rule. I want to keep it simple. So rather than mess with the weight of this, I'm just going to mess with the point size. And what point size should I make it? Should I just eyeball it? Well, yeah, kind of. I mean, that's what most designers do. But I always like to start using some kind of rule of thumb. I think this helps. So here's the rule of thumb. If you have two pieces of type, this piece, and this piece is less important, then make the point size half. So if we're at 90, we can make it 45. Now, this does feel a little bit small to me, so let me just select it and bump it up a little bit. Now it's at 50, that feels better. Always remember that these things are rules of thumb and you should never be a slave to them. So now we've got our hierarchy set. We're using as few weights and sizes as possible. And there's one more thing we need to do here, which is to be precise and use a common measuring unit. Let me tell you what that means. Right now, the left edges and the right edges of this block of type, they're not exactly lined up. They're close enough, but trust me, designers will notice this stuff and your clients may notice this too. So always be really precise. And here's how I do that in After Effects. I'm gonna hit Command R to bring up the rulers, and then I can click either on the top ruler to bring a horizontal guide down or on the left ruler to bring a vertical guide. And that's actually what I want. I'm gonna hit the period key on my keyboard to zoom in a little bit. And I'm gonna line this up as best I can with the left edge of that E. And I'm gonna grab another vertical guide and line it up with the right piece of type right on the edge of that S. Now, because these type layers are set to be centered, this is gonna make it really easy to make them the same size. I'm gonna make sure that their position properties are right in the middle of the comp. This is a 1920 by 1080 comp, so that means that the X position in the middle is gonna be 960. And now you can see a problem. The serifs on the D are sticking out too far. So I'm gonna nudge this over a few pixels to the right, and then I'm gonna need to scale it down a little bit. So let's grab the scale property and just nudge that down ever so slightly. And then we'll check the right side and maybe nudge this over a tick. And that looks pretty good. And we know that this layer is centered, so that's fine. Cool, so now we've got things nice and precise on the sides, but what about the spacing between these layers? So I always like to start with a rule of thumb with spacing. And remember, you can always break that thumb if you don't like the way it looks, but let's at least start here. The trick I'm gonna show you is this. I am going to come up here to my shape tools and I'm gonna grab a rectangle tool. I'm gonna make sure none of my layers are selected so I don't accidentally draw a mask on them. And I'm gonna pick a lowercase letter, let's say this N right here. So I'm gonna zoom in, I'm gonna go to the bottom corner of it and I'm going to drag a shape and make it the exact size of that N. It's kind of hard to see with the stroke, so let me hold Option and click to get rid of the stroke. There we go. And then I'll add a fill and let me turn the opacity down on this so I can see through it. Great, that's perfect. Now, why did I do that? Well, here's why. Your eye is really, really good at noticing patterns, and there's this concept in design called rhythm. So if you have things equally spaced apart in a design, your eye will notice that. It feels like a constant rhythm, and that feels good. Even if you're not actually aware of that rhythm, if it's subconscious, it still makes a design feel better. And we're gonna do that by creating a rhythm based on the vertical size of lowercase letters of one of the type layers. So this layer here, this is my spacer. I'm gonna tap Y to bring up the anchor point tool, and I'm gonna move the anchor point to the bottom center of this. And here's a little trick. If you hold Command while you do that, it will snap to the center and the bottom. And so now what I can do is I can adjust the scale of that spacer layer. I'm gonna unclip this so that I can separate the X and Y scale. And then I could scale this up in nice increments like 200. And this is useful because now if I bring a guide down to the top of that layer, and then I select this top layer and I nudge that down until it's touching that guide, I can turn my guides off and deselect everything. And if we zoom in closely, you'll see that the height of the N is exactly the same as the height of the gap between the letters. And that feels kind of nice in a really subtle, subconscious way. And I actually think that feels fine, but if you feel like that's too close, well, here's what you could do. Let's zoom back in, let's turn our spacer back on and set it to 300%. And now I'll just move this piece of type up to the top of the spacer. And let's take a look at that. And that works too, but I think because we have this extra piece of type on there, I want these two to be a little bit more connected. So I'll just undo that and bring them back where they were. And so now we can deal with the URL. How far away should the URL be? So let's turn the spacer back on and set the scale back to 100%. And let's move it up here so we have a visual reference of the spacing between these two layers. Then I'm gonna duplicate the spacer and I'm gonna bring it down so that it's touching the top of a lowercase letter on this type layer. And then I'm actually gonna parent it to that type layer. Cool, so now let's set the scale of this to, I don't know, let's say 400%. And then what I can do is I can grab this bottom type layer and I can move it down until that spacer is touching the bottom of the type layer above it. And then we can select everything and just kind of move it up in the frame so it's a little more centered, and then turn the spacers off. Cool, and maybe that's a little bit too far if the type is at this size. So let's turn that spacer back on and let's try 300%. Cool, that feels a little bit better to me. You can see I am experimenting and trying different things, but I'm doing it all based off this one unit of measurement, which is the height of a lowercase letter of one of my type layers. And this is called using a common measurement unit. It's a really great way to ensure that there is some visual rhythm to your type designs. And so now let's turn our background layer back on. Now, of course, you can't read this type, but if you watched the first video in this series on value structure, you already know how to fix this. And if you didn't watch that video, you can click this to go watch it, or the link is in the description. So really quickly, I'm just gonna put a levels effect on this image so we can read the type. I'm gonna lower the white output just a little bit, and then I'm gonna make an adjustment layer, and I'm gonna put that in between the type and the background. I'm gonna call this fade. I'm gonna put a levels effect on that as well, and then I'm really gonna darken it. And then I'll draw a quick mask on this layer that basically just follows the shape of the type. And then I'll feather that thing and just play with the opacity until it's not super noticeable. Now this feels way too big to my eye, so what I'm gonna do is parent these two type layers and the fade layer to this primary type layer, and then just scale the whole thing down a little bit, and maybe nudge it up just a little bit. And so now you've got something that's pretty passable if you're doing any kind of corporate work. You could also do some other tricks to make the type a little bit more readable. I blurred the background slightly, put a blue gradient over the entire thing, and just kind of reduce the contrast. And by the way, some of these tricks I did show in the first video in the series. And none of what we did was very hard. We were really just kind of following a few simple rules and following a process. And I've got one more bonus tip for you. But before I tell you, I do want to let you know about an amazing course we have taught by Jake Bartlett called After Effects for Editors. If you're an editor and you're being asked to animate and design things and you feel a little bit out of your depth because you've never really been taught the principles behind good motion design work, this class is for you. Jake is going to take you through the After Effects interface. You're going to be really comfortable with it, and you're also going to learn some of the secrets like we're discussing in this video to making great work without really needing to have a full design and animation background. You're going to learn everything you need, nothing you don't, and the link is in the description. Check it out. So here is one more example of setting type, and you can see I've done exactly the same things that I did before. There's a common measurement unit. I'm using contrast. I'm only using one typeface here. This is actually Tuna, the same typeface. And I don't know, this feels a little high, I might nudge it down, but other than that, this actually feels pretty decent. But there's something that I think could be better about this. It's something that I see people do all the time when they don't have a ton of practice designing and getting critique on their work. And this is especially true for editors. So here's what I'm talking about. When you're an editor and you're in Premiere or After Effects, it doesn't matter. A lot of times you're looking at your work in this little window right here. But that work might get played on a giant screen or at full screen, which is this amount of room. And so every once in a while, it's good to go full screen with your design. And when we do that, holy cow, is that type humongous. Most of us are used to working in these tiny little project windows or comp windows in After Effects, and that tends to cause us to make type way bigger than it needs to be, especially if you're going for something cinematic. So let's zoom back out and parent these two type layers together. And I'm gonna scale this about half the size it is right now. Right now it's 1/16. Why don't we scale this down to 60? Now I know what you're thinking. You're looking at this and you're thinking, oh my God, that's too small. But remember, you go full screen and all of a sudden, it's not too small. In fact, it feels a little bit more like a movie title. And if you pay attention to feature film titles, you'll notice a lot of times the type is really, really small on screen. And that's because those movies are intended to be seen on big screens, not little comp windows or little project windows in Premiere. And now that it's this small, this bottom layer feels a little bit closer to the top one than it did. And so I might just nudge it down a little bit and just kind of use my judgment. Remember, we're allowed to break thumbs or break rules of thumbs. So I can knock that down a little bit. And I might even change the color of it so that it's not pure white. I might bring it down to sort of a still pretty bright gray, just so that it helps the hierarchy. And now the title of this movie, Frank, really pops. It's bold. It's the brightest thing in the scene. My eye goes there, which if you watch the first video in the series, you'll know why I did that. And then the secondary type here, it feels like it's connected to it, but there's a lot of contrast, and it clearly is secondary to this information. And the whole thing is nice and small in the frame, and it feels considered. There's a lot of negative space around it. Boom, I like it. So don't be afraid to go full screen, take a look, and then shrink that type way down. If you look at this line right here at this size, it feels pretty small. But when you go full screen, it feels good. And those are my tips. Thank you so much. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel because this is part of a series and there will be more tips. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a good one.